hold my speech then. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jared Clark, and it's an honor to be here to talk to you today about climate change and what it means for our province, our economy, and our future. I wear a lot of different hats in my life: teacher, scientist, small-scale farmer, father, and I find myself worrying about climate change regardless of which hat I'm wearing. I live on a farm outside of Edenwald with my wife and twins who are 6 years old now. And as a member of that community, I'm also concerned about how we deal with climate change while also honoring the jobs of hardworking Saskatchewan people and our provincial economy. It's a fine balance. I love living on the farm and being part of the agricultural fabric of this province. My family has been raising goats for the last decade now, and as anyone living in the country knows, it can be tough. But boy, I know my family wouldn't want to be anywhere else. But the last little while, it's sure been dry around my place, as it has been around southern Saskatchewan. I mean, really dry. Yes, we've had droughts here before, but we just had the driest 15-month period in 130 years. And I want you to think about that. That includes the dirty 30s. I looked online at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's drought monitoring page today, and sure enough, Regina to Saskatoon is still in a severe drought as of December 31st, 2018. If this persists, I'm really worried about where my family's water is going to come from in this future, or in this summer. I'm worried if my pastures and hayfields will grow, and I know many others are equally worried. But it's when I wear my hat as a father and as a teacher that I am most worried about the climate crisis. What will the future hold for my children, for my grandchildren, for my students, for your kids or your grandchildren? Now, we can pretend that climate change is a hoax, or you can argue that the climate has changed in the past, so we have nothing to worry about today. But here's where I want to push back on that thinking a little bit. How do we know that the climate, or what the climate was like in the past? Well, it was from climate scientists. And who is most concerned about the crisis we are facing today? Those same climate scientists. Now we can look to the Arctic, where we have seen a 40% decrease in sea ice since the 70s. We can look to coastal cities like Miami, where sea levels are rising and flooding streets regularly during high tides. In fact, the city of Miami spends millions of dollars each year raising the roads and installing submersible pumps that run 24/7 under the roads to pump the seawater back into the ocean. We can look at unprecedented fires in California, destructive hurricanes in the Philippines and the United States, floods and droughts across the world. We can look to insurance and reinsurance companies like Munich Re. Their data clearly shows extreme weather events related to climate have increased 3 times since the 1980s. 3 times. Or we can look at the Great Barrier Reef and see that in the last 3 years, half of it has died because of warmer ocean temperatures from climate change. Half. And I could go on and on and on. It's all right there in front of us. And now, with this information, picture me standing in front of my class of grade 6 and 7 students. And like many teachers, I wonder, what am I supposed to tell them? And of course, the answer is the verified truth. And so I do. But I don't teach them in a way that scares them. I don't want to shy away from the reality that we're facing, but I teach them that there is hope. As we have every solution today that we need to solve the climate crisis. As you saw in the video that we started with tonight, the solar generation, we have great potential in this province to be leaders in renewable energy. When my class visited the Katalyst First Nations renewable energy facility on the edge of Regina, my kids saw what we can do. That wind solar battery facility is part of the future of clean renewable energy, and it's the first of its kind in Canada, being led by Katalyst First Nation. But it's not just renewable energy that's the solution. There are so many other things that we must do. From passive house technology to electric car use, to rethinking how we move around in our cities, to protecting native grasslands and forests that sequester carbon, but also regulating heavy emitters and fugitive gas release. I'm certainly grateful to my friend Stephen Hall, who produced the solar generation with my class. He raised up their voices when it comes to calling for climate action. He gave them a platform to share. And you know, that video has now been viewed over 27,000, I almost said million, 27,000 times. And I make sure that my students understand their voices matter, because it's their future at risk. And at this point, some of you might be saying, well, that's great, Jared. You know, we've talked about the Arctic and coral reefs, but that's far away. What does it mean for Saskatchewan? Well, that's the question. What will our future in Saskatchewan look like? According to the Prairie Climate Center in Winnipeg, if we don't invest in a cleaner, healthier economy now, it will mean warmer winters, which we're already seeing, of course, not really a surprise. And on the face of it, sounds like not a bad deal, right? But when you begin to understand what warmer winters mean for us, it means the arrival of black-legged ticks, which are expected to arrive here within the next 10 years. And with them, they will bring Lyme disease. And we will need to deal with that disease in a way that this province has never dealt with before. And if you're doubting me that climate change is bringing ticks, look to Manitoba right beside us, because they're already there and they weren't historically. We can expect more summer days filled with smoke from forest fires in the north and the health concerns that come with it, especially for children and seniors. We can expect more drought as 30-plus degree days increase from an average of 16 days per summer in the last 3 decades to about 50 days per summer in the next 30 to 40 years. Now think about how your basements will do with the shifting and the drought that will be associated with those days. We can expect extreme weather events putting more pressure on farmers and other industries, and the government budgets that must respond and react to these events, perhaps without adequate resources. Unless, of course, we find a different way. So what can we do? Well, here in Saskatchewan, I think we should acknowledge and thank the people who have helped build this province and helped it to prosper. Those who have powered it, folks like those in Estevan and Coronach, and we should be grateful for what they've accomplished. And then we need to talk about what climate change will mean for this province and its people. And then we need to demand leadership from our provincial government. We need a government that puts forth a vision and a framework to help hardworking Saskatchewan people in this province transition to a cleaner, healthier economy and make sure that Saskatchewan not only does its part, but stays strong. We have such great potential here in this province already. Now, I've heard recently our former premier talking about how Canada's emissions at 1.6%, it's so insignificant that there's nothing we need to do to help be part of the solution. But I want you to think about this. There's 195 countries in the world. Now, except for 3 or 4 of them, almost every nation could make that exact same claim. So either every country on this planet does its part to reduce emissions, or alternatively, we'll have to look our children in the eyes and tell them that their future doesn't count. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Lucy Pelche from Cowessess First Nation.
Oops. Good evening, everyone. Yep, that's good. Thank you. My name is Lucy Pelche, and I am from the Katalyst First Nation, which is in the southern part of the province. And where you've seen the solar panels is outside of Regina, which is on our treaty land entitlement land that we acquired early in the 2000s. And we deliberately left the land undeveloped so that we had an opportunity to create a sustainable development plan. And we've gone through different hurdles in our lifetime as a community of trying to create economic opportunities as well as economic strategies that would be creating meaningful employment along with creating wealth for our nation. In 2009, I was the Director of Economic Development for our nation, and we partnered with the Saskatchewan Resource Council to conduct a wind study project. And, it was just by fate, I call it, that we were bestowed this wind tower because the feds had it here in Saskatchewan, and they didn't want to pay the transportation fees to ship it back to Ontario. So, so it was easier for a First Nation to take it on and start a wind study project. And unfortunately, there were no programs, no grant. There was nothing available for us back then to be able to do this program. So we partnered with the Saskatchewan Research Council, and they provided their technical advice as the sweat equity into the project for their part. And we provided the land and I guess myself to kind of oversee that project. And it sat dormant for about 5 years after the data was collected, because after you collect the data, then you have to do a business strategy. And the business development piece was where it was weak, because the nation needed $1 million of their own equity to do this project. And $1 million wasn't pocket change to the nation. So in 2012, they created the Katalyst Wind Developments Limited. And that corporation holds a 20-year power purchase agreement with SaskPower, and that has 15 years left. So we've been in this game for 10 years already, and the research that we've done has basically been a patient capital investment, and with very little support from any government to do the project. Even though as my esteemed colleague here alluded to, all the indicators of climate change and all the indicators that we should be changing the way we live our lifestyles, the way we look at the way we look at the natural resources that Mother Earth has given to us and how we've taken advantage of that. And we wanted to be able to harness that in a good way so that we weren't damaging our environment, damaging our air, damaging our Mother Earth. We wanted to do it in a way that that held our values, the way we were raised as a people, and the way our teachings from our ancestors have taught us to live harmoniously with the land, with the creatures, and with the environment. So to me, it was just organic for us to engage in a project such as the wind study project. And as we gathered that data, the data became valuable to those who wanted to do business. And we follow good governance practices. We have an independent audit. We have a board of directors that has a skill set in this area. And we continue to have the relationship with the Saskatchewan Resource Council as our partner that provides our technical oversight on the project. We also have a long-term maintenance agreement with Enercon for our turbine maintenance. And in 2018, we renegotiated our power purchase agreement with SaskPower to maximize our contract through the addition of the solar panels that you've seen in the video. We are installing 400 kilowatts of solar power, and we have an additional 100 kilowatts of equipment procured and awaiting contract opportunity. Our current project costs about $2.3 million, which does not include the sweat equity that the nation had incurred over the years just to sustain the project, park the project, and keep the project alive. Through Western Economic Development Diversification, they funded the project $910,000 last year. Indian Services Canada, Indian Affairs as we call them, funded us with $800,000 as a business readiness grant. Our nation has invested $180,000 of its own cash into the project, and then we do debt financing for $500,000 from the First Nations Bank of Canada. The benefits that we've achieved through this project is our nation has developed a good sense of pride that we know that we are making a difference in the future, and that we are teaching our children how to protect Mother Earth and to carry on our values and our teachings so that it lasts in perpetuity. We're taught our values according to our treaty principles, and our treaty principles, has basic simple language such as long as the grass is green, the sky is blue, and the water flows, which means perpetuity. And we believe in that wholeheartedly in most of our endeavors that we undertake for this project. We're very proud that we were able to utilize our land outside Regina. It was strategic so that we could hook up to the main power sources for SaskPower. Some of our barriers that we've incurred is our equipment is innovative, our equipment is current, it's up to date. In order to hook up with the SaskPower main grid, they have to upgrade their system. And they can't afford to do it. So they want us to invest $2.3 million on the province's infrastructure system so that we could sell power to them. Which is kind of ridiculous, but we did cry out to some of our politicians, and I give my chief, Katalyst Media, great credit for his perseverance in talking to those provincial politicians. Because our reserve land is reserve status, it's federal jurisdiction, and the province doesn't take a lot of interest in our property, doesn't take a lot of interest in our developments. However, I think that's time to change, and I think that Mr. Miley is going to do that with Renew Saskatchewan, and it's going to provide an opportunity to build bridges and to create partnerships with First Nation communities, such as my own, others that are also trailblazing across Canada. There's the Connie First Nations in Alberta that has been doing this for 20 years. And they've had an agreement with the Alberta government for the last 10 years, but them too, they had to sit there for 10 years waiting for somebody to pay attention to what they were doing. And so a lot of patience, a lot of perseverance, and I call it a patient capital investment because you definitely have to be patient for it. The investment is huge, but the return, you can't put a value to that. So, hi, XA.
Okay, so next is Justin Fisher.
Hello. Is that okay? Everybody hear me? Okay. People always say just to talk normally into these things, but I don't normally talk very loud. So I've been asked to come and talk today about a project put on by a group that I'm involved with called Climate Justice Saskatoon. You may have heard of us. I hope that you have. We're a grassroots collective of folks in and around Saskatoon that are working hard to raise awareness about climate change, to do research into policy around climate change, and really hammer home the urgency of this issue, and as has been laid out here already tonight. And the project that I'm going to talk about is something that I think will hopefully broaden the conversation that we're going to have here tonight as well, and talk about the need for policies beyond just Renew Saskatchewan and other things that are needed to really get us where we need to be. So you may have heard that the federal government has mandated a phase out of traditional coal-fired electricity by 2030. You also may not have heard about that because we don't really talk about it in Saskatchewan hardly at all. Despite the fact that we're one of 4 provinces that actually impacts, along with Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Alberta. And between Alberta and us, that's really the bulk of it. And Alberta has actually done quite a lot on this, not necessarily in the way that we would like to see. They're rapidly converting a lot of their coal facilities to natural gas, but they are a ways on that road and putting in supports for workers and communities that are currently coal dependent. Climate Justice Saskatoon has for years advocated for phase out of coal in Saskatchewan as a particularly low-hanging fruit. The reason that Canada has kind of made this a centerpiece of its emissions reductions plan is that in 2016, coal accounted for only 10% of electricity production, but 77% of electricity-related emissions. So it's just the most carbon-intensive way to produce electricity. And in Saskatchewan, in 2016, we were still using coal for a little over 40% of our electricity. Of course, or presumably, the reason that we don't talk about it a lot in Saskatchewan is because we have some communities that are heavily dependent on that coal for employment and revenue. So again, as a group that has advocated for a long time for phase out of coal, it occurred to us kind of late in 2017 that despite talking about phasing out coal and through that about coal producing communities, we hadn't actually taken the time to go and talk with coal producing communities about what that would mean for them. So we really felt the need to go down to Estevan and Coronach and talk with folks about their views on a potential phase out and what sorts of supports they would need to make a just transition away from coal. I was really fortunate to get to be the person that went and traveled down there. I had never been that far south in the province before, so it felt really good to go down there. It's super beautiful. I don't know, probably a lot of people have been, but since then I went and camped in grasslands, and it's the greatest. But I definitely had some trepidation going down there, being some guy from Saskatoon, an urban environmentalist, going down to talk with people whose livelihoods are really at stake in this conversation. And fortunately, I couldn't have been more wrong in having that apprehensiveness. People were really eager to talk about this issue because, as I said, nobody talks about it. Nobody's asking people what they think about it. So that was kind of the most overwhelming sense for me, was just being welcomed into these communities who were clearly ready to have these kinds of conversations, clearly needed to have them. So I just wanted to go over quickly a few things that we learned, some of which were not surprising, some of which were a little bit more surprising, and then a couple key takeaways, and then I'll tell you where you can find a little bit more about this. So not surprisingly, people in both Estevan and Coronach are really concerned about their jobs. Both these communities, but especially Coronach, really rely heavily on coal for employment. And there's a lot of concern about what happens when those jobs disappear, not just for the people directly employed, but what that means for the entire community. Even a place like Estevan that's relatively diversified, they've got a lot of oil and gas workers, a lot of agriculture, et cetera. There's a lot of concern about kind of the domino effect of losing that. And that's something that obviously needs to be taken very seriously. I should also, I meant to make this disclaimer at the beginning, having spent a few days in these communities and talked with a handful of people, I can hardly be considered an expert on these communities or speaking for them, just about my experience and kind of what I learned there. The second thing that was not so surprising is that there's a lot of doubts about the viability of renewable energy and how that's actually up to the task for supplying our grid, particularly through the winter and with rising demand, rising population, and that's another concern that has to be taken really seriously and answered and communicated with these communities. The surprising things that we learned, I thought, were a lot more exciting, though. First of all, I realized that we're all concerned about the future. Whether we're talking about exactly the same things or not, maybe doesn't actually matter that much. As Climate Justice Saskatoon, and just as myself, I worry relentlessly about the future. about having kids, about my niece, and just about what this province is going to look like. But folks in Estevan and Coronach, I mean, some people share those same fears, but they also worry about the future of employment and stability, the future of energy prices and that kind of thing. So that's some common ground that I think we can actually work on together. Secondly, I learned really quickly that nobody's being served by not having a plan. You know, there's clear disappointment in the provincial government from all sides, and that was really surprising to me. I thought going in that folks in these communities would kind of appreciate that the provincial government has been stalling on this file, but actually, from what I heard, that couldn't be further from the truth. People are actually really feeling uncertain about what's going on, and one of the key takeaways is that that's already having a really tangible impact on these communities. People aren't sure if they should stay or if they should go, if they need to uproot their family and try and start over somewhere else, or if they can continue to make a go of it there. Investment in the community is declining in a lot of cases. You know, like people are worried about their rink and where that investment is going to come from. So these are things that are already happening in 2019. When we think about this as an issue that's going to come to a head in 2030, we have to realize that this is happening now and people are looking for certainty. So the other really key takeaway is that we need really clear planning and communication around this issue, and those plans and that communication needs to include these communities. It's not going to be good enough to just drop some plans and expect people to be okay with it. These people really have a lot at stake and really want to be involved in these conversations. I think I'm going to leave it at that for just now. Happy to take any questions at the end, but you can find a lot more about this online at climatejusticesaskatoon.ca. We've got like a 50-page report that you can read if you want to. We've also got like podcasts and videos, other ways to engage with that research if you're not into the 50-page thing. There's more to come as well. We've got another researcher who's working on more of a technical report right now about how to actually make up the balance on the grid without coal, and particularly how we can get to 100% renewable electricity in Saskatchewan before 2050, so I'm really excited about that. And also, if you want to hear more about this, one of my co-authors, Haley Carlson, and I will be giving a talk at the Public Library as part of the Sustainable Speakers Series on Tuesday, February 19th at 7 p.m., just down the street there. So that'll be a bit more of a comprehensive presentation, but thanks for that.
Okay, that's great. So our next speaker is Caitlin Harvey, who is currently doing a Master's of Laws at the University of Saskatchewan. Caitlin, it's all yours.
So thanks everybody for coming out. As Tracy said, I'm a lawyer in Saskatoon and a grad student at the College of Law. I'm from Prince Albert, here with my daughter and partner Luke, who is doing a fine job with the cameras today. I want to talk a bit about policy, climate litigation, climate policy, international relations with respect to climate change, and kind of the development, the history of the movement is an area that I have been following for quite a long time. So I'll just give you a bit of a background about kind of where I come from and why I really think that this is something that needs to be done and invested in. So I started on this journey of learning about climate change and what I could do to make a difference in about 2004. I first, heard about global warming and kind of was taught in my very first geography class about just how big of a problem it is and the sources, and it wasn't 100% confirmed, but you can't really get to 100% certainty with most things in science. And there's this call to action even back then, and it really struck me. It hit me, at home, and I needed to learn more. I needed to figure out, well, how does this work? What are these things? Earth systems. What is the hydrological, I still can't pronounce it, cycle. You know, how do all of these things work? And so I approached these issues from the science perspective for a few years. Learned everything I could about the atmosphere and, you know, the water cycle and how everything is connected. I worked at Environment Canada for a year and a half as part of my geography degree and collected data, looking at the differences in precipitation and modeling the changes projected for particularly the Beaufort Sea Mackenzie Delta region to see what are the impacts on permafrost and you know, communities and infrastructure, what's happening now and what can we expect going forward. And after quite a few years of studying the science end of it, it just kind of occurred to me that these changes were not going to be made by collecting data. Yes, that's important, but I wasn't hearing these things in the media. I wasn't hearing these things being talked about by politicians. This stuff wasn't, you know, wasn't out in the public, and so it kind of, you know, occurred to me that law was the way to start voicing concerns and demanding change. So I went to law school. And throughout all of my 3 years at law school, I geared all of my courses around international law, comparative analysis, Indigenous rights, and negotiation. You know, trying to find common ground between competing positions. I'm not an adversarial person as being a lawyer. You know, the arguing part just doesn't really suit me. I like to try to find common ground. Everybody has, you know, their interests that they're coming from. And, you know, we all care about our kids, our family, ourselves. We all are interested in health, education, food, water, you know, having a roof over our heads, a job to go to, benefits, all the same things, right? We have a lot of shared interests, but how can we get people to just come to that place of, okay, we got these problems, and now we need to work together to find those solutions. So after university, or after my going through law school, I articled for a bit, practiced criminal defense law with my mom in Saskatoon here, and, you know, seeing the impacts of social, you know, justice issues, criminal justice issues in particular, and the impacts of poor policies, and you know, for primarily Indigenous people, it's felt like practicing law just felt like I was a cog in the wheel. You know, I was just going and seeing these people being pushed through the system, knowing that the source of these problems lay in policy. It laid in the people who are making these plans, that set the rules, that shaped people's, you know, their futures, and seeing people suffer because of the lack of good policies. And so after practicing for a bit, I had an opportunity to go back to university to do this master's degree in environmental law, natural resource development, Indigenous rights. And so I'm in year 5. They usually say 2 years is the maximum amount of time people should take to do a master's. I have, you know, family obligations, and it turns out the topic that I wanted to research is extremely complicated. So the area that I am looking at is climate change litigation and the history of litigation in other countries around the world, and the development of that jurisprudence in different courts and the rationale that's applied in the courts, and looking at the arguments that have been successful and not. But taking those successful cases, and there's been quite a few over the past few years that are particular relevance to Canada, but looking at what happened in those cases, and could similar arguments be made in Canada? And if those arguments were made in Canada, what might they look like, and what are some of the hurdles that could exist? And the argument that I'm exploring is if that argument were based on a violation or infringement of a constitutionally protected Aboriginal right under Section 35. So that just makes it even more complicated. If you know anything about Aboriginal law, it's clear as mud. So that's my background. That's where I come from. Trying to understand these issues from a science perspective, as a mom, as a Saskatchewan resident, as a person who likes to camp and be part of the environment as much as possible. And for this whole time, it doesn't matter which angle I've come at it from, it keeps coming back to policy and the lack thereof in Saskatchewan. And I see what other provinces are doing and other countries are doing, and they're doing things that we could be doing in Saskatchewan, and we don't have to be taking jobs. This is the potential to create so many more jobs. It's a potential to be self-sustaining, energy sufficient or self-sufficient. We don't have to depend on selling our resources to our biggest purchaser, which is the United States. Just, one of the things people like to talk about, Canada only contributing about 2% of the global amount of emissions. But they don't like to talk about the fact that we export a lot of emissions to the United States, who is number one, number two, world's biggest emitter. So we don't, those emissions are not, we don't emit those. Those are not ours. We make a lot of money off of selling the oil and gas that the U.S. is responsible for emitting. But we try to have clean hands about it. But we are responsible, and people think that Canada and Saskatchewan doesn't have a big role to play. We're a small province. We've got, not a whole lot of people compared to other places. We have, people just try to minimize our role. But Saskatchewan has the highest per capita emissions than any other province. I don't know the exact stats. I'm not that good of a numbers person, but what I've read a couple years ago is that if Saskatchewan were its own country, we would have the highest per capita emissions than any other country in the world. So if you think of our population and the footprint that we have as a province, it's huge. And a lot of that comes from developing these resources and transporting to other places, or just having our energy come from coal, different sources that have a huge footprint. And we have the technology to get that energy from clean sources. We have these things that are being talked about, solar panels and electric cars and all of these great ideas. These are not the fairy tales. They've been doing them in other countries for decades, and they're proven. And we can learn from the lessons and the mistakes and the successes from so many other places. What did government of Saskatchewan earlier this year cut funding to the climate change, Saskatchewan's climate change and adaptation policy, or the program, from 4 million to 3.2 million or something like that. So they're cutting funding to something that really needs to be invested in, and it's the wrong direction to go. So I'm, again, really supportive of this initiative, and just really glad that everybody's out here and we're having these conversations. So thank you.
You've cut me off. There I am at. Thanks, Caitlin. So now we're going to hear from you-know-who, and hardly needs any introduction, but it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Ryan Miley.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. I read a lot of Harry Potter with my son Abraham, so being introduced as you-know-who isn't necessarily the most flattering for those who are familiar with the books. I do want to thank Tracy and the Meewasin Executive for doing such a great job of organizing today. For those who are watching online, you can't see, but there's over 100 people here today. And so thanks for everyone for coming out. Thanks for the organizers. They even did the classic New Democratic organizing technique of booking a room that's too small and not putting out all the chairs till you got here, so you really feel like it's a full room. So thank you for that little bit of extra warmth. And just thanks everyone for being here tonight. It's great to see so many friends. I see some former patients, neighbors, and so many folks from my NDP family. There was a little girl here before who was 2, and we've got a fellow who's going to be 102 very shortly. Harold Chapman is here. And we also have 2 elected members of our NDP family. We have Vicky Mowat, the MLA for Saskatoon Fairview. And the MP for where we're standing right now, and my MP from Saskatoon West, Sherry Benson. And I know there's also quite a few people in this room who have already declared that they'll be seeking nominations for 2020, and others that I haven't bugged enough yet for them to do so. But I really want to thank everyone who's looking at that process and seeing themselves as putting their names on a ballot, or looking around to see who they can support and be part of their campaigns. Because for us to make the changes that the folks up here are talking about, there's some political work we have to do as well. We'll get back to that, but I first want to just finally thank the group who's up here for sharing their stories and their ideas. This is an incredibly inspiring and varied group of speakers. I'm really happy to be able to share the stage with them, so thank you so much. And what I'm always listening for when I listen to a speaker is what the story is that they're putting across. And we heard stories of a teacher and farmer and father, stories of the work of a First Nation that's taken a real leadership role, of the engagement with coal communities, and how do we actually work with folks towards a just transition from one way of life to another, making sure that along the way, as we're looking to reduce emissions, we're not reducing people's livelihoods and making their lives worse in the process. And of course, Caitlin's own process of how she's thought through her own journey, academic and policy-wise, and what her role can be. And it's really about stories that I think when I think about this issue of climate change as well. And usually the first place I go when I think about climate change is to the emergency room at RUH. That's where I go in my head. And if anybody's been in Peds Emerge with a kid and known what that's like, that anxiety and agony as you're seeing your child sick in front of you and wondering what's going to happen. And I imagine a young mom who's looking at her 5-year-old child, 5-year-old son, and watching that kid struggle to breathe because they had to leave their home in the north of Saskatchewan and come down and stay in a big gym here in Saskatoon when they were evacuated from the fires. And now, because of the air outside and the smoke in the air outside, the air inside that kid is making them very, very sick. And I think about stories like that and how climate change is this big, vast idea, but it's also very real in people's real lives. I think about the travels over the last couple of years visiting farmers in their kitchens and hearing them tell the kind of stories that Jared was telling about drier years, longer years, years where the growing season is actually changing, or wet years, wet year after wet year where it used to be not so wet. Everything being disrupted and them wondering, how are they going to actually even know what to plant anymore? How are they going to know how to do the work of farming that land when it's changing so much? And will they be able to continue to survive in that field? And I think of those stories because I think sometimes climate change is so huge. Our planet is being disrupted. And it's the, the biggest health risk in centuries, maybe ever. It's 12 years, we hear, until it's so disruptive that there's no going back in any way. And you hear that, and it's powerful, but it can also be pretty demotivating. What the heck can we do? And even, Brad Wall's bad math on, we're only a couple percentage. That's him trying to deflect away from doing anything. But you can hear how that's attractive to people to say, we're not that big a deal. Maybe we shouldn't do anything, because it's just so overwhelming. And I think when we bring it back to human stories, when we move from billions of dollars in insurance claims to what it's like for a family to be sifting through their belongings after a fire or a flood, hoping something that they cared about survived, it becomes so much more real and much more tangible to us. And then we have to talk about, those are the stories of the harm. But we also have to shift to the stories of the hope, of what is it that we can do, and how do we bring that down to the level that affects people's lives and means something to them on a personal level. Who in here recycles? Yeah, everybody, I'm not going to scan and look for the one guy who hucked a tin can in the garbage yesterday. The general idea you get, everybody's hand goes up because it's something that's just become normal. But it wasn't always like that. When I was growing up, I never heard of recycling. Our recycling was burning the garbage in a bin on the farm, which I'm sure many of you can relate to. We've changed, but we didn't change just snap overnight. It started with a few people who pushed and asked, why all this garbage? Why are we throwing out so much stuff? And started thinking about how can we reuse some of it? And how can we reprocess it to use it in a new way? And they were the early adopters and the advocates for change. And over time, that spread into the rest of society. And then you get systemic change. You get one town that says we're going to have a recycling program. And now it's just the norm. It would feel so weird to throw a pop can in the garbage. Just would make no sense to us. So you see how that kind of shift can happen. And I think we've got an opportunity in Saskatchewan right now to tell a different story. Now, Jared and his students made it so clear how much we can do right here in Saskatchewan in terms of solar energy. There's also an incredible opportunity in wind, in geothermal, in biomass. We're a place that should be leaders in this area, but we're not. We're way behind most of the world, even in Canada, where we're behind at the same time as we're these great producers of carbon emissions. So what's going on? Why do we have this great opportunity and we're not doing anything? Well, as I travel around and I meet the early adopters, I meet people out there who are advocating, but I also hear a lot of their neighbors who say, oh yeah, I'd love to have a highly efficient home, a passive home. I'd love to have solar panel array in the pasture or on the machine shop. I'd love to be part of a wind co-op. That'd be great in my community. Hey, if we had panels on our rink, we could power the rink and the town hall and be saving so much money. But who's got the money to get started? Who's got that initial 10, 20,000 for a home or a couple $100,000 for a smaller business or community hall? It's such a cost barrier. And I believe that's the biggest thing that's preventing us from making a shift towards distributed energy production, greater local energy production, energy produced closer to where it's used. The biggest user of electricity in the province is the lines, because we're transporting it from the southeast of the province and losing so much along the way. There's a great opportunity to produce more power, and the people are ready. 80% of people in the province are interested in being part of a transition to renewable energy. Because Abraham Lincoln said that if public sentiment is with you, nothing can fail. But if it's against you, nothing can succeed. Well, in this case, it's with us. People want to be part of this, but that barrier is in their way. And that's where Renew Saskatchewan comes in. And Renew Saskatchewan is an idea that's based on, one, this need to make this change and the opportunity, but also on some things we've done in this province already. In the 1940s, under Tommy Douglas and the CCF, there was rural electrification, which is something that's part of all of our legend and history, and it's actually really amazing when you think about it. Electrical power as part of powering cities and homes actually hadn't even been around that long, and they managed to distribute it throughout rural Saskatchewan. And one of the pieces of how they did that was when you got the line connected to your farm, you actually paid for it, but you paid for it by having your power bill, and over time you paid for that installation of that infrastructure that was helping you get access. Another program that I heard about during the leadership race, people talked to me about something that existed in the 60s and 70s called the Family Farm Improvement Branch. Anybody remember that? A couple hands, but not a lot. So that one's kind of flown under the radar, but it was actually really substantial, where you had a lot of farms that were still using well water or cisterns, and they weren't, or outhouses even, and they weren't able to have clean water and good indoor plumbing. And so there was a program where basically someone would come around, assess the farm, and say, here's what you need to modernize your operation, and here's how much it would cost for us to do it. And if you want to do it yourself, we'll sell you the equipment at cost, and you can go ahead. So I kept thinking about these ideas and how that could relate to the need to make the transition to renewable energy. And that's where the idea for Renew Saskatchewan came about through discussions with lots of people in the field, including some who are in the room today who helped with the thinking around this. And here's how it works. If you are a farm or a business or a small town, someone from Renew Saskatchewan, connected to SaskPower and SaskEnergy, which is one of the other great advantages that we have in this province, is that we still own our crown corporations, and we can be part of using them to make this change. So we work with those crown corporations, and someone comes out and does an assessment and says, here's what you would need. Here's the best way from an economic savings point of view and an energy production and energy savings point of view to change your home or your business, your farm. And here's how much it would cost, and here's how many years it would take to pay it off just by paying your power bill. And that's the big part. This is the key thing that takes away that cost barrier, is you get a loan to cover that initial investment, and you just keep paying the power bill you're already paying. You probably even pay less. And over a few years, you pay it back, and eventually your bills are next to nothing, or maybe you're even making money because you're selling power back to the grid for others to use. That to me is the exciting thing about this idea, because one, it makes us make that transition to clean energy. It's also an opportunity to create thousands of new jobs in manufacturing and installation, and it's a way to drop people's bills, so it makes life more affordable. And maybe the most exciting thing about it is it's a loan, so you put the money in once and it comes back, and you can keep going through and through. It becomes really a revolutionary program in that it is a revolution of the funds, and because it's bringing power to the people. So that works pretty well. So that, to me, that's what Renew Saskatchewan is. And I'm really excited about it because I think it's a chance for us, thinking back to stories. I know, Tracy, you did a door-knocking blitz a couple of months ago. And Tracy and the Meewasin executive went out and banged door to door, and they said, they told people about this. And on the doorstep, it just made so much sense to people. It's something that they can be part of in the big picture, but also it's on their roof. It's on their power bill. It's a change in their immediate lives. It's something they can feel a part of. And this is where you start to move from the early adopters and the advocates to the rest of society, where the people who think that they're opponents of this kind of change become the proponents, become the ones who are talking to their neighbors. And that's when we make that shift to systemic change, to this just being how things are done, to where having your power come from coal is as crazy as chucking a tin can out the window of your car. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. And that to me is really exciting. But of course, and I know Justin and Climate Justice Saskatoon and others would say, you're only talking about electricity. There's other parts of what produces emissions here in the province, and that needs to be part of the greater discussion. And we also need to have a greater discussion about where this fits into an overall vision of who we are as a society and the types of things that we're going to do. For us as New Democrats, that means working to make a more equal society, a more just society, more fair society, one where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, so that there's not people working full-time and living in poverty like we see today, but people earning a decent wage, earning at least a $15 minimum wage. Where we're working to, sure, you can clap for that. We'll clap for a $15 minimum wage. And where we shift from what I saw in so many of my patients, and I'm sure so many of you have experienced in your friends and neighbors, people having to choose between paying the rent, paying for groceries, or paying for the medications they need to stay healthy. And instead we have full universal pharmacare as part of our Medicare system. And with the growing concern and growing, fortunately, discussion and awareness of mental health issues, where we start to see our health system expand to not just be your body, but include your mind and your eyes and your teeth and take care of the whole person. That's where Renew Saskatchewan has to be part of that larger story, that larger vision of who we want to be as Saskatchewan. A young man interviewed me the other day, just a couple days ago, about tonight's event, and was asking me about comparisons to the Green New Deal discussion that's going on in the States. Some of you may have heard of that, but it's an idea of rather than where we've been on a lot of the discussion around environmental policy, which has been very much in the risk and the really fear side of things, where we shift into the hope and where we start to see the opportunities in policy that reduce emissions as also opportunities that are economic stimuli, also opportunities that increase our quality of life and that are part of that larger social package and larger vision. And that to me is a really interesting comparison. And it's great to watch what's going on there. And maybe, when we're talking about Renew Saskatchewan, that isn't just a loan program to get you solar panels on your roof or a better furnace or better windows. Maybe that's exactly what the whole package is. It's about renewing more than just renewable energy. It's about a renewed health system. It's about renewed education, about a renewed economy. It's about a renewed sense of justice and equality. It's about a renewed story of who we are and who we've always been in Saskatchewan. And this, New Democrats, is exactly where we come in, because we are the party that has been a party of big dreams, who saw a problem and turned it into a great opportunity to lead and to take better care of each other. And we didn't just say, that would be wonderful, I hope somebody does it. We got to work and we got the job done. Thank you very much.
There, I'm back. We're now at the part of the town hall where the hall gets to speak. And so we're doing this as a live event on Facebook. And unfortunately, we need to speak into the mic, which I got reminded because I started off not speaking into the mic. So for those of you who have questions, we can bring a mic out to you to a certain extent, but we also have a microphone set up over there. So yeah, and we'll just kind of move them around as best we can, and we'll try and get the town hall part going. So I see somebody over there, so why don't we start with that mic and we'll go with the first question.
Hello, thank you. It was a great discussion, but I wanted to ask Ryan that the NDP, we're facing election in another year, and I would like to see us get some heavy hitters on board to support this program beyond the individuals. So I'm thinking federated co-op and the credit unions. There's a co-op and a credit union in most small towns. And if we can get them on board and supporting this whole program, it would be great, because people could see in their own community. So are we looking in that direction?
That's a That's a great idea. Thanks very much for mentioning that. One of the things that we are doing is reaching out to see who can be partners in this enterprise overall. And I think the credit unions and co-op are a great possibility. I think that's a good opportunity to point to Julie Sanderson, who's president of the local Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and think about the role that post offices can play. And they've been having a great campaign around both allowing you to bank at your post office, but also being a center for green energy. So great to think about what are the different existing infrastructures and natural partners that we can reach out to try to build momentum for this. Thanks for that idea.
There's another question coming up.
Hi, Ryan. I'd like to hear some more on the mental health and upstream thinking on how we can switch from where we are now, where people are dying without care, especially in the north.
Thank you, Marilyn. That is something that it has been discouraging to see how many people are struggling with depression, with anxiety, with addictions, the levels of suicide that exist in our province, all over the province, but especially in northern communities, as you point out. It is also, as I alluded to earlier, encouraging that we're actually talking about it. Because for so many years, this is something that was brushed under the rug. There was so much shame and stigma associated that nobody wanted to even bring it out into the open. And now, hopefully, that is changing. That it's still a big challenge, but it is changing in terms of the conversation. And one of the things we did, Vicky is our health critic, but we also added a mental health and addictions critic, Danielle Chartier, for the first time. So to really focus on the importance of that. And over the last session in the legislature, we were working with people whose lives have been affected by addictions and by struggles with mental health, and having them tell their stories to really make it clear just how much people are struggling today and how difficult it is to get care when that's the case. So often, and I remember this from practice and I continue to hear it, people would come in and say, I'm struggling with an opioid addiction or addiction to crystal meth, and I want help. And the answer was, that's great. We're so glad you want help. How's 3 months from now? Well, if you're struggling with an addiction, you might as well have just said never. And so we need to make sure that the supports are available when people need it, that we're being opportunistic in meeting people when they're ready, when they open the door, that there's actually somewhere to walk into. That's on the downstream side. And of course, you mentioned the upstream side. When you look at the root causes of mental health challenges and addictions, absolutely they are connected to the larger determinants of health, to people's education, employment, income, access to housing, access to decent food and nutrition. When we're talking about trying to create a healthy province, from our minds to our bodies, we have to be talking about those upstream factors and how we use our understanding of that to guide the decisions that are made throughout the government.
Okay. Another question from over there? Yep, go ahead.
I just wanted to say I'm very excited about the opportunities that this affords Saskatchewan to become a leader again in just moral policy. And I was wondering if there's any plans with Renew to expand the vision to things like research development, manufacturing, training of a new generation of people to be able to implement these ideas, and retraining those who may have felt they were left behind by the transition into moving into something that they can see a future for themselves in.
Does anyone want to jump in? Ideas to share? No. How about I'll give a quick answer, and then you take that gives you some time to collect your thoughts, and you back clean up. So yes is the simple answer. I think we have to look at all of the opportunities that this kind of investment gives us. This is an economic stimulus because it creates opportunities for local companies to be part of supplying and installing. Even within the Renew Saskatchewan structure, you need the people who are helping do the assessments, helping do the evaluation, and even the accounting side of it, because it is really a loan program. It's quite substantial. And then the opportunities for manufacturing right here in the province, and for leading the research towards opportunities for energy storage, et cetera. There's so much. It's one of the great things about Saskatchewan. We're big enough that we can do something like this, but we're also small enough to be a really fascinating laboratory for some of the great ideas. And we've seen that throughout our history, and it's somewhere we can go again. The other piece that I like about this is that it's not for Saskatoon, it's not for Regina, or even just for Coronach. It's for everywhere. This is something that distributes throughout the province. So the opportunities for economic development and for revenue sources for smaller communities that actually want to be feeding power into the grid, they're incredible. And so this is something that connects rural and urban Saskatchewan, which I think really matters as we start to be told this story over and over again, that we're a divided province, which frankly, I think is a manufactured story, that we aren't a divided province. When I'm traveling around and I'm sitting down and talking to people, they understand these ideas. They want to be part of the whole conversation, whether they're in my neighborhood a few blocks from here or where I grew up between Moose Jaw and Gravelburg. Everywhere, people want to be part of this. And I think Renew Saskatchewan can also be part of renewing some of those bonds and connections between urban and rural.
You know, to supplement that query, it gives an opportunity for the Indigenous communities to develop their land that they've acquired through the Treaty Land Entitlement process. And the Treaty Land Entitlement process has given the nations a fee simple land base, and that provides them with some ability to provide some equity into projects in addition to not having the barrier of the Indian Act preventing partnerships or any kind of synergies like that can transpire. There's an opportunity for manufacturing to occur, and it's interesting because we never wanted it in our communities or close to us, but now that we've been able to purchase land strategically throughout the province, then that gives us that opportunity to participate in those economic development strategies, as well as having an outreach into a greater and a bigger community of Saskatchewan, which to me, regardless if we've got a rural boundary, an urban boundary, or a reserve boundary, we all use that energy in the same way. We all use and have an environmental footprint. So we're all in it together, that we have to create synergies that we can start teaching our children, so that it just becomes organic way of living, as opposed to a policy or a force-driven process of the way you live your lifestyle. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Just to remind our internet audience that we are, you can post your questions online. There's an ability to do that, and we'll try and get an answer for them. And George on Facebook just asked, coincidentally, what kind of incentives might you have for First Nation businesses to install renewable energy under this program?
Do you have anything you want to say?
Well, I'm actually a director of the First Nations Bank of Canada, and I also sit as the chair for the Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation. And the Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation is a developmental loan company for entrepreneurs to develop businesses, startups, or acquire existing businesses, or create partnerships. And energy, alternative energy, is one of the top areas that we like to encourage young people to get involved in, and not only because we have an agricultural portfolio as well as we try to encourage innovative energy practices to our farmers by sharing different resources from different farm practices that we gain across the country. Because there's 56 AFIs across the country that lend money to over 7,500 Indigenous entrepreneurs that have a GNP impact in this country, which is very rarely acknowledged by any federal government or anything like that. But I think it's an excellent opportunity for our young entrepreneurs to have that innovative thinking. We give them opportunities through our program, and we also showcase our young people, such as Kendall Netmaker, who's had businesses in the city here. And there's a lot of front store businesses that you don't know that they're Indigenous owned, but they are. So they do have an economic participation in our economy. Thank you.
And to George's question, there are absolutely details that yet are to be worked out, and it's going to be meeting with folks like Lucy who are experts in the best way to do this with community. But I see this as a really great opportunity. There was an article a few months ago that showed a map of all of the First Nations communities that had renewable energy projects on them across the country. And there were dots all over the country. And then there was Cowessess, was the only one in Saskatchewan. There was nothing. And that was really embarrassing. And it, I think, is a reflection of how little the government has been willing to engage this. And even, Sask Power needs to do some work as well on their willingness to make this transition. That's going to be part of the discussion we have to have. But at the same time, there's an enormous opportunity. There's an appetite. There are strong leaders who are ready to do this kind of work. Communities who've gone out on their own and done it without the partnership, with a ready partnership. I think I talked about the way that this can bring together rural and urban, but it can also bring together on and off reserve in a really exciting way.
Harold, did you have a question? I heard that you might, so I'm going to bring the microphone over to you. This is Harold Chapman, if you haven't met him before.
I've met a lot of you folks before. My question relates to, do you see a role for cooperatives in renewing in Saskatchewan? And I would like to comment that years gone by, I worked with the Department of Cooperatives in Saskatchewan, organizing rural cooperatives and recognizing that when you set up a rural cooperative, you need to be in a position to help them legally to get started, help them to provide training for their directors, for their manager, for the accountant. When we talk about organizing cooperatives, we need to be thinking about the training that's required by the people who are going to be helping with that, including the members. Now, I happened to be around at the time that I was organizing rural power cooperatives in the Prince Albert area at the time that the government decided to set up a cooperative throughout Saskatchewan. Those co-ops that I helped to organize became part of the Saskatchewan Power Corporation back in the late 1940s. But my question is, do you see a role for cooperatives in Renew Saskatchewan?
Thank you, Harold. Part of me wants to say, geez, I hope I'm that sharp when I'm 101, but I'm not likely to be anything when I'm 101. What an amazing person. And not only does Harold have a great history with co-ops in Saskatchewan, he wrote the book on co-ops in Saskatchewan, Sharing My Life by Harold Chapman. Please check it out. It is great. And again, the answer is yes. Often, just because it's kind of easier to understand, we talk about the individual home or farm level, but some forms of renewable energy make a whole lot more sense with a larger organ. And we do have a successful solar co-op here in Saskatoon. There's now one in Regina. The co-op model, I think, could really work well with Renew Saskatchewan when you get into communities wanting to put up wind where that's the right opportunity, or biomass, or looking at some of the different kinds of geothermal that are coming on board, the smaller geothermal that can be really a helpful way of having even power that you don't need to store because it's always on. Those really lend themselves much more to a co-op than an individual business or a home. So I think that's a great model and a great opportunity for us to reintroduce and reinvigorate the co-op movement that has been such an important part of Saskatchewan's history and prosperity.
Julie, you've got the mic.
Hi, thank you. My name is Julie Sanderson. Ryan, you gave me a shout out. Thank you very much. And which gave me an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that I have done with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And we have been so inspired by Renew Saskatchewan and the work that you're doing. We've envisioned a new post office, a post office that uses the existing infrastructure. But the discussion that I heard from Justin, I've heard you talk on this issue with regards to the work that that your community organization is doing with the work that you're doing in looking at ways of dealing with people in working Canadians, working people here in Saskatchewan. And many of us here in this room are working men and women in this province. But we don't want to be left behind. We want to be a part of the discussion. We need to be a part of the work that is being done right here in this province. And when we look at a just transition, that transition cannot leave working people behind. So I'm just curious if maybe, I know in your little leaflet that you handed out, Ryan, it's great, and you talk about good jobs, and certainly I understand what it's like to come forward with ideas about how inventing new ideas of ways to do what we've been doing forever and ever, amen. But I'm just curious if maybe you can speak a little bit more about good jobs. I know you responded to the speaker earlier about good jobs and how we address jobs and what that looks like when we renew Saskatchewan and we move forward. And Justin, if you, just to give Ryan a break for a moment, if you could maybe speak about a little bit further about what it is that you heard from those people that you met with in Cornac about how they want to be involved in a just transition. Speaking with working men and women in this province, the United Steelworkers is a group of workers that is really concerned about how they will be taken along in this ride for a renewed Saskatchewan. So if you could speak to that, that would be great, Justin.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. I think talking to folks in Estevan and Cornac, it became quickly evident that like different kinds of workers will be affected differently by this transition. Like the electricians union, for example, there's a lot to look forward to because we're going to be using electricity one way or another, and those skills are going to be in demand. People working in mines, that's going to require a little bit more creativity and retraining. I think a couple of things that were really exciting. There was definitely openness to renewable energy. A really fascinating thing about Estevan and Cornac is they both kind of lie. I don't know if you remember the graph that was in the video from that Jared had put together, but Estevan and Cornac are both in that band of incredible solar potential as well as really good wind potential. So there's a lot of potential for retraining and working in renewable energy. So continuing to play that role of supplying power to the province that those communities are really proud of. And I think another thing that was really interesting, especially in Cornac, is a lot of folks down there have backgrounds in farming. And we heard again and again that people want to farm. And this kind of tied it in for us that these communities are kind of caught up in this overall trend of rural decline that we haven't talked a whole lot about. Certainly in Saskatoon anyways, paying attention to that. But I think finding incentives to enable smaller scale farming where people can be putting labor into that again. Right now, most people that are farming, it seems, are also working in the mine to kind of make ends meet. So I think there's a lot of things we can do creatively to get people working where they are. I think one of the priorities for folks there seem to be staying in the community as much as possible, not just being retrained to move elsewhere. But tapping into that renewable energy potential, supporting small-scale agriculture, I think those are a couple of options that would help people stay where they are.
And just a small addition there, I think, first of all, I want to thank Justin and Climate Justice Saskatoon for doing that work, and it's work that we as New Democrats need to do, and that I'm very disappointed and frustrated that the Sask Party hasn't done. They know this is happening, but they're trying to tell us, oh, don't worry, we'll figure something out, instead of going to those communities, listening to what's on people's minds, and thinking about the reality that these are communities that are particularly at risk because of this policy change. So these are communities that all should be particularly targeted when we're looking at other kinds of renewable energy projects. Because we're talking about Renew Saskatchewan and the way that we can have the distributed, locally produced energy. We are also, as part of the transition to renewables, going to have larger wind farms, larger solar arrays. We want Sask Power to be a part of that. It works from a geographical point of view. It also works from a justice point of view. And then the last little bit to add to that is there has been some criticism of Alberta and the way that they have approached this and not necessarily involved the workers the way that they should. And that needs to be a lesson we learn and make sure there's nothing about us without us, that we're working directly with folks in Coronach and Estevan to understand their needs and their hopes and their skills that can be applied in other ways.
Okay, I said I'd look at my watch at about 1:45 and we'd see where we're at. It's 1:45. There's a couple more people lined up for questions. Shall we let them ask questions and see what they have to say? Okay, the audience has spoken.
Tejinder Gareva. The main argument from the other side, you know what I mean, other side is that all this clean energy stuff or renewable energy stuff, it will hurt our industries. It will hurt our oil and gas industry, coal industry, farming industry. It will hurt our jobs, economy, prosperity. What is our counter argument? An elevator pitch, a 1-minute response. I'm looking for just 1-minute response to that argument. That it will not hurt economy, it will not hurt jobs, it will not hurt our prosperity.
Does anybody want to take a run at that?
Right now, the World Economic Forum says the #1 threat to the global economy is climate change. The cost of not acting on climate change will far exceed the cost of acting on it.
Another thing I would throw in is that I think we're at the point in time where we need to be having really honest conversations about the costs and benefits and trade-offs of climate change and climate action. We need to be honest that our economy is not going to look the same. There are going to be people that are going to suffer economically. There are going to be people that are going to come out okay. And I think that we're mature enough that we need to be having those conversations about what that means for us, what that means for different communities, and how we can work through that together. I think some people get turned off when we say, like, oh, don't worry, like, this is going to be economically great, like, this is going to be better than ever. For everybody, that's not actually the case, and I think we just need to kind of reckon with that as a province, as communities, and just figure out what supports we need to make it work for as many people as possible.
The other thing I would add, sorry.
Caitlin, did you want to weigh in on that as well, about the risks of not doing something?
Sure, yeah, I just pull up some numbers here that I got in my notes because I can never remember this stuff. But, there's a recent study out of Stanford University that estimates that by the end of this century, if we don't take action to reduce our emissions, that's going to result in climate-induced damages that are going to cost about 25 to 35% of global GDP on an annual basis. So if we don't do something, it's going to cost a heck of a lot of money and lives and our children's future. So how much is that worth to people, really? on the other hand, the International Energy Agency, in their World Energy Outlook report in 2018, they estimate that the additional cost of transitioning to a sustainable development path is going to cost about 0.2 to 0.5% of global GDP. So it's significantly less. And if you think of all of the economic opportunities, the jobs that can be created, the possibilities, I think there's so much more potential to build that, grow the GDP, not just by having new jobs and having, these economic benefits, but think of how much money we're going to be saving if we're not having to rebuild our highways that have been flooded out, and all of our farms that you can't, plant anything in because the soil is too dry, having to irrigate, or what happens when the glaciers melt in BC and Saskatchewan's rivers run dry. The North Saskatchewan River, a lot of that is fed from glacial meltwaters. That's a reality we have to be thinking about.
Great. Yeah.
And so what does that cost to people, right? So that's just something to think about.
Super.
And one small addition, because it would cost way more to not do anything, I think is a very good argument. It's also worth looking at our economy now. It wasn't very long ago, oil prices crashed and we're in big trouble. Uranium prices have crashed and there's hundreds of people out of work in northern Saskatchewan. So how do we actually use this opportunity to create a more stable, more diversified economy by investing in things we won't run out of or that aren't so volatile in terms of world pricing? I think that's got to be a big part of the discussion as well, is how do we actually create the type of economy that leaves us less vulnerable to shocks at the same time as causing less damage to the world that supports us.
Okay. All right. We've got we've got two last questions. Great. Okay. So we'll shut the mic off after you. Thanks. You're on.
So one thing that I've heard lots about is justice, all pertaining to climate justice, renewable energy, green energy, and the like. But something that I haven't heard related to it all is the human aspect of this, what it can do and what it means for our justice system, for tackling our recidivism rates, and getting down to some of the basics when it comes to mental health and addiction services. I guess we have organizations such as Straight Up in Saskatoon here, which have our social enterprise going. We're doing retrofitting. We're slugging it out. We're making it by just on the good word of our good work, I guess. We've constantly asked the province for help, in supporting these initiatives. We've proven that it keeps people out of jail. We've proven that it keeps people in the communities that are struggling with mental health and addictions issues. We've shown that it provides jobs and real opportunity. I guess my question for you, Ryan, when you become premier, would you be willing to look into proven models such as what Homeboy Industries does in California, where close to 1,000 clients or clients, I guess, have gone through their solar energy program with over 92% of their candidates graduating, 70% of those getting a placement rate placement within 90 days of graduation. That organization every month, coast to coast, they do up to 10,000 tattoo removals, and I think 5,000 people a month walk through their doors. Can we count on you to support those type of initiatives, working with First Nations like Katalyst and others to develop programs where we can get people working instead of just locking them up?
Thank you, Shane, and thank you for the work you do with Straight Up. Shane handed me a copy of the anti-gang strategy. He's been working on building healthier communities, and that's what it's all about. It's about working upstream to help prevent crime, but also when people do and get involved in the system, how do we actually help them to get better? And I like that language. I've heard you use it before, Shane. You shouldn't be looking at people as good or bad, but as sick or well. And our justice system is largely designed to punish. We have very little in the way of rehabilitation. Programs like Homeboy, which I'm just learning about from you right now, but sound pretty cool. Ways to get people training so that when they come out, they've got a chance. I was talking to a former chief the other day who was talking about someone from his community who had been in and out of jail all his life. And it costs $100,000 a year to keep somebody in jail. And he said, you know what, for that guy, all we would have had to do is spend $30,000 a year and have a place for him to stay. We would have saved way more money and he wouldn't have had such a lousy life. So let's have a real hard look at our justice system. How do we support people to stay away from getting involved in criminal activity in the first place? And how do we help them build healthier lives? A point of contact with the police shouldn't be a sentence to more and more time in prison and more training to become involved in more crime. It should be a point of contact to get better, to get healthier.
Okay, last one's going to be a good one, I just know.
You can feel it, hey? First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming up with this plan. It's about time that we had someone with vision in this province to figure out how we're going to transition into the future and deal with climate change. So thank you for that. And I imagine that when you do become premier and Renew Saskatchewan is implemented, that demand is going to far outweigh supply. At least I'm hoping it does. But the question I have actually has to do with, I think a lot about what a lot of the critics are going to say about it. And I think the first thing that's going to come out of their mouth is, how is this going to get paid for? Who's going to pay for this? Now, there's two words in this province that come to my mind, but they're dirty words in this province. But it's carbon tax. But I'm just wondering if your vision includes any kind of use of the carbon tax towards transitioning us, or if there are other financial means that you're looking at to do that.
Great question. And we could probably spend all night talking through that one. There's lots to pick apart in terms of how do we deal with the whole debate on carbon pricing. But frankly, I wouldn't say that that's relevant to Renew Saskatchewan at all, because it's a program that pays for itself. Because it's a loan out to individuals and communities that gets paid back, that money isn't lost. It's put out and able to be renewed and reused. Now, where exactly does it come from? Does it come from general revenue fund? Does it come from a special savings bond? If carbon pricing is bringing in lots of money, is it something there? That's all part of the debate and the discussion. But the fact of the matter is, this is affordable. We've got a government that just spent $2 billion to help you avoid Regina, which is not something I recommend. Regina's great, but that seems to be what they want you to do. And they spent $2 billion to pump carbon in the ground to get out more oil, which, there's lots to be discussed about carbon capture, but the way they've done it is not decreasing our emissions in any real way. So they found money to do things that don't work. We can find money to do things that do.
Well, this brings us to a close. It's been a great town hall. I'll have to say this is the first time I've ever moderated one. It's actually relatively easy. People do behave themselves. I want to thank our internet audience that was out there on Facebook, and hopefully we'll hear who you were and how that went, and hopefully you were able to hear us when we weren't speaking in the mic. I know, I'm sorry about that. But just again, if it wasn't clear before, we had Jared Clark come up from Edenwold, I think is your hometown, and Justin Fisher from Saskatoon, and Lucy Pelletier from Cowessess, and Caitlin Harvey from Saskatoon, and of course, I won't call him you-know-who, but Ryan Meyer Riley from Saskatoon. So as we close, I do want to acknowledge that we held this gathering on Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland, and I'm really proud that we did so, and that we did so respectfully in the concept of truth and reconciliation. And I'll just remind you that if you want to do something cool with your smartphone, just text that number, you get a nice message back. And you can show your support for Renew Saskatchewan by doing that. And the other thing that I hope you'll do is when we put a call out for volunteers to come help us go door knocking, whether it's to actually knock on the doors and carry those flyers around that we're going to be delivering to all of the doorsteps in Saskatoon, whether it's can you make a pot of soup for us or do some cookies, I hope you'll volunteer to help us spread the news about Renew Saskatchewan. So thank you all very much, and it's a good evening. I've enjoyed it. Congratulations, we're through. We did it. I would wonder what it looks like on Facebook. Eh?